Hello there. I believe we're live. Welcome to an exclusive and very special MPO office hours live here at Recognition PR Broadcasting Studios in Darlington, God's country, the northeast of England, and of course streaming live on the Amazon Web Services Twitch channel. My name is Chris Masey. I'm your host for today, deputising for Jason Thoday, who usually anchors the show. So used to seeing Jason's face. Now, like Jason, I'm an account manager at our non-profit team with a focus on enabling and supporting social housing providers with cloud adoption and transformation. Now, usually what you see on the MPO office hours, we have more of a technical focus. We might explore the console a little bit with our team of solution architects or even feature successful customer projects. But for today's session, we thought we'd go and dive deep into social housing, which is the domain that I work in, with the help of a very special guest who I'll introduce you to in a few minutes. He's just there, but the camera's not going to take you there just yet. Before that, though, I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes providing some context on social housing in the UK, so we can all appreciate and acknowledge the important role that it plays in our society. So let's start with the definition. What is social housing? Well, in essence, social housing is accommodation housing provided at affordable and low market rates to individuals and families who are in need of housing support. We sometimes term this as in-housing need. And crucially, this type of housing also comes with a secure tenancy if you can get it. To give you a sense of scale, 9 million people in the UK live in social housing. So that's a fifth of all households. There's around 4.5 million social housing properties and around 1,700 what we call registered providers. Now, they can either be housing association non-profits that we support in the team here, or even local authorities. Now, these organisations own and manage these properties on the customer's behalf, carry out rents, repairs, all the things that you'd expect. Now, the coronavirus pandemic has reinforced the need for housing providers to support our most vulnerable and transform those traditional service models. At a macro level, biggest challenge in the housing sector is that demand for social housing outweighs supply. We need to be building around 300,000 homes per year to meet those demands, but we're currently only building around 150,000. What does that mean for people that cannot access this type of housing? Well, it invariably means that families or individuals are forced to reside in unsuitable temporary accommodation while waiting for social housing to become available. So think of a bed and breakfast with one room for a family. Or alternatively, people being forced to use the private rented sector, which is often expensive and short-term in tenancy type. Now, all housing providers are trying to build as much as they can because of these challenges. So when we consider how these organizations adopt technology, the objective is to deliver the most efficient and cost-effective technology service as possible, so money can be reinvested into building more homes and helping communities thrive. Okay, moving on to the interview. So now one of the organizations that is influential in helping housing providers understand and adopt the latest and greatest technologies to deliver against these challenges and missions is the Disruptive Innovators Network. Now, everybody likes an acronym. So for the purpose of today's show, we're going to refer to them as DIN. Now, DIN are a membership community of housing providers. They come together to collaborate, share ideas, and drive transformation in social housing. The man who created DIN is the CEO and founder, Wright. And I'm delighted to say Ian joins me now for what we sometimes refer to in Amazon as a bit of a fireside chat. So now I've got the auto cue out of the way, Ian. I've never used one of them before. We'll get to the meat of the conversation. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Chris, and a great introduction there, and a nice journey through, I suppose, social housing in the sector as well. So yeah, look, great to be here.
So I think we're going to start before we get into the network, because I think my objective today is let's go deep on the network and the work that you're involved in and celebrate that success. But before we do that, tell me about how you got into social housing. What was your first experience in the housing sector?
Right, wow. We're going back a long time, possibly before you were even born, in terms of back in the early 80s. And I suppose a bit like a lot of people at that point in time, and possibly still to this day, you almost sort of drift into social housing because it's one of those areas that I suppose is often hidden.
Yeah.
And I started just at the local council down the road on one of the sort of the graduate recruitment schemes, fast tracked through, spent a couple of years, I suppose, learning how to use telephones, which is what we had to do in the 80s, paying bonus on the workforce, calculating payments, doing all sorts of sort of administrative stuff. And then a couple of years in, some posts came up for some housing assistants. There was a new chief housing officer that was coming in, and he wanted to transform the housing department, and he wanted some people who just had never worked
So
in housing
you actually
before.
started on the front line in a housing office?
I started on the
In
front
the
line.
80s?
I started, yeah. So I think my first
So that's
job,
42 years ago, just for the viewers. That's 42 years ago, just to be clear. So you can all guess Ian's age now.
Yeah, it was a while ago. Thanks. Where's Piers Morgan when you need him? It was interesting because it was one of those times that, you started off. I think I started in the summer, and my first job was actually to go out and inspect tenants' gardens.
Okay. Yeah.
So you start off and you just start to get to know your community.
Yeah.
You get used to talking to people and having conversations. And I ended up doing nearly every job that was available within housing, managing the area housing officers, policy, strategy, all of that sort of stuff, which laid a really good foundation for what was to come.
Excellent. So how did you then start bridging into the technology space? I mean, did it become apparent to you early on that you were interested in how technology enabled the type of housing services you're involved in? I mean, how did that journey start?
Well, you say going back to that point in time, there were no housing management systems. In fact, I think Sedgefield Council, Sedgefield Borough Council, where we worked, that was the first, I believe, one of the first integrated housing management systems, which was set up by Orchard, a company you'll be familiar with.
And they now, of course, are living, because that was the stock transfer from Sedgefield, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So as I say, we were pivotal in terms of helping them develop that. So it was good to sort of get in and see how that technology worked. But it was also an era whereby I seem to remember whiling away a good afternoon, loading about 20 floppy disks of Lotus 1, 2, 3 to get things sort of installed. So
this is real legacy. I mean, we use the term legacy so much, don't we, in housing at the moment? It's one of the most common terms alongside transformation, but that really is legacy. I mean,
it really was. And for any of those sort of colleagues of my era, you'll remember a lot of the manual systems you had to have in place. If you're going out rent collecting, you had your Gilbert strips, you had paper forms for housing allocations and things like that. So as I say, it really was at the beginning point of technology coming in to transform the social housing offer, really.
So when did you start that kind of process of cross-pollination into doing something with housing, but not necessarily directly on the front line? I mean, did it start with that whole networks and communities piece?
I've always been an avid networker. I love meeting people. I love talking to people and learning all of the time. So, there was a really good, I suppose, class of 88 of people who were just getting into their housing careers. And in fact, quite a lot of them now are serving sort of CEOs. They've gone on to really, really big roles within.
So that's potentially a direction
sector.
You could have gone in CEO directly for a housing provider, I guess.
It was, but it probably wasn't what got me out of bed on a morning. I think sort of my skill set lies in a different sort of space, because as I say, I've always been curious about what's happening elsewhere. What's happening outside of the sector, and that's, as I say, sowed the seeds for where we are now.
Yeah, we're going to get onto 3D learning later. Yeah, I just love that as a phrase, and that is absolutely one of the strengths of the network and the work that you do. I do have on my notes card here, though, a Tony Blair story. So you've got to tell us about your Tony Blair story. Was this at Sedgefield?
Yes. So obviously, the viewers will be familiar. Tony Blair went on to become Prime Minister, but at the time, as I say, he was just a local constituency MP.
He was the Sedgefield MP, wasn't he?
Yes, he was, yeah. And the story's not so much about him. I did meet him a few times. He did some speaking sessions for me. But my chair of housing, John Burton, was his agent. And John was a proper, really good local community councillor and a proper character.
Sure.
And as I say, I would have quite often go to meet with him, and we'd meet in the constituency office, which was in a small pit village in one of the Trimdens, Marabella House, if I recall. And I remember John recounting to me this time that he gets a call from Phil from the local windows, doors and conservatory company. And he picks up the phone and says, "Hi, it's Phil. We're just getting in touch. We're a local manufacturer of secure windows and doors. We've noted there's been quite a few break-ins and burglaries going on within Trimden. Our windows and doors are A-rated, highly secure, will prevent burglaries and things like that." I know
where this might be going. But
well, so he then proceeded to say to John, so how's your security where you're at? And John, without any sort of hint of irony, says, "Well, we've got a guardhouse, we've got infrared trip sensors, we've got bomb-proof glass, and we've got 2 armed special forces agents." And all Phil could say at the end was, "So you don't want to quote then?"
That's being connected, isn't it? That is absolutely being connected.
Absolutely, yeah.
So how long were you at Sedgefield for then? I feel like this is a bit of a walk me through your CV type discussion, but I'm interested. I've worked with you so long and I didn't know this stuff.
Yeah,
I'm embarrassed by that.
No, I was there for about 12 years. As I say, it went through every different iteration of job.
So that's quite an apprenticeship in housing. There must have been enough to keep you challenged throughout that time.
It certainly was. Yeah. Now, I don't know whether it was, they kept moving me on because I didn't do that job particularly well, or it was a fact they wanted me to sort of, develop. I mean, really good.
We'll assume the latter for the basis of the interview.
Yes, assume that. So that grounding in everything from policy to strategy to technology to the community engagement, all of that sort of stuff really, really helped me in terms of understand the whole offer of what social housing actually is.
Okay. So in terms of the networks and communities piece, how did that all start? Were you still at Sedgefield at the time?
Yeah, I mean, we did a lot of engagement out, again, going and looking at other organisations, looking in this case, particularly housing organisations, right? So there was a lot of collaboration went on. And again, that's something that stayed with me for many years now in terms of actually, we're all facing very similar problems. So what can we learn from each other around that? So that built up. So again, that widened that sort of network within the Northeast there, which was really, really helpful. I think I really started to look at the power of communities and networks when I suppose I left the council and went to the Northern Housing Consortium, which was one of the emerging membership networks for social housing.
Still prominent today.
It's really, really grown and gone on. And so I went in there to be the events manager. I'll be honest, I hadn't actually organised any event by the time that I got there. So again,
you still can't organise them now.
I'm still trying. I'm still trying. Thanks, Chris. But but the lesson around this was you go into an organisation and quite often, you are at your least skilled when you first get the job.
Sure.
And I always think that actually that's probably the best time because you will learn very rapidly because not everything's going to go right. You're going to make mistakes, and it's really important that you learn from those mistakes very rapidly. And boy, did I make some mistakes in sort of my first few months and probably years there. But what it allowed you to do was it developed your skills in resilience. It developed your skills in negotiations and just dealing with uncertainty. And, we live in uncertain times now. And
do you think in many ways that provided your foundation to be a bit of an innovation specialist? Because we know innovation and failure are synonymous, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things that, try something. What's the worst that can happen? And probably time for another interview looking at some of the things that did go wrong. But, you're in a position that you develop coping mechanisms for this. And that certainly helped me in terms of I would deliberately put myself outside the comfort zone.
Yeah. Sure.
So, I'm not a natural public speaker or necessarily a brilliant communicator, but you put yourself in that position so many times, actually, it's, you develop a technique and an ability to sort of do that.
Well, I mean, I could have said at the beginning of the show, usually it's role reversal, isn't it? Because you've interviewed so many interesting people. I mean, I've been at your summits and you've interviewed the vice president of Twitter and the CTO of Ocado and all sorts. I mean, you get some amazing people building on that 3D learning theme. I guess you've done that with the network. We'll perhaps come to that a little bit later on, and innovation will definitely come to a bit later on. So how long were you at the Northern Housing Consortium for?
I was there for 12 years. I had 2 innings at the Northern Housing Consortium. Okay. One was split when I went out and tried my hand at consultancy. Failed miserably. I just wasn't ready for it, and it was tough. But I learned more in that time. Trying to do that, I just wasn't mature enough and didn't have the skills to be able to handle that. But again, those lessons have stayed with me now. So I had sort of about 12 years in total there.
So what did you do next? When was the natural time for you to move on from there?
Well, the leading the consortium, I was approached by the CEO of a national benchmarking data organisation called Housemark, and I was invited to apply for the role of the director of sort of membership, basically, because that's what my interest is. My skill set is growing communities, networks, and scaling them, and that's what's of interest to me. So I went there and I spent 6 very, very happy years there. Basically, I suppose adding to the offer of the business, but in particular about transformation, leadership. So, we're heading to where we are with Din now, and looking at sort of technologies and learning from others. Yeah. So we established those, and they were very successful. And certainly, I think that's probably where working on a national stage you get more recognised. So a lot of the people you work with now are people that you came across at that point in time.
And Housemarque is still very prevalent, as usual today, with their own summits and their own strategy and initiatives and so on. I'm going to take a little pause at that point, because I'm going to let the production team know that I don't have an earpiece anymore. So I'm really sorry, but I may as well be honest about that. So you can't hear me. So you're just going to have to just wave hand signals at me if there's any problems. I'm also going to say that we do have a chat board here, which we're able to look at. And you can see it. We've got people from Israel, we've got people from Washington, DC. And you've got someone that says your skin looks great for being over 40. So if anything, you've got a morale booster.
Absolutely. Yeah. Wama 94.
Thank you very much for your comment.
Yeah.
Now there's a few questions that come through. We'll maybe come back to questions in a little while, because I want to get into the network now. I think we've done well on time there, and there's so much more to talk about. So I know when I started at AWS nearly 3 years ago now, I was told straight away to come and speak to Ian Wright about the work you were doing in housing. And I remember being a stalker and looking at your LinkedIn profile and realizing we had around 100 mutual connections, but I'd never actually spoken to you. But I'd never come across Din at that time, and I'd come across a lot of the other influencer organizations in the sector, having worked for Orchard. But how did Din start? When was that moment that you recognized there was a need for it?
Probably about 4 or 5 years ago, when a lot of organizations in the social housing space were setting up innovation teams. And it was something, I suppose, whether you class it as flavor of the month or what have you, but a lot of organizations were recognizing we need to do things differently. So therefore, how do we sort of innovate? So there was a lot of these that were sort of cropping up. And then there was a really good guy called Tom Way, who worked at Richmond Housing Partnership at the time. Had just established and sent round to say, look, I'm pulling about 12, 15 people together to from the social housing space and from some tech suppliers, just to have a chat and just see if there's some mutual areas of collaboration and interest that we can actually get together on and work. And I thought, wow, that's a brilliant idea. I wish I'd thought of that. So when you don't think of something, what do? Well, you nick it. And anyhow, I had a chat with Tom, and as I say, part of the challenge with anything with growing the communities is how do you scale them? Yeah. It's great. There's lots of small scale networks, but how do you actually scale them and then have real impact? So I had a conversation with Tom and with the CEO, David Donut at RHP, and said, look, this has got real potential. Is this something we can sort of, explore? And it was about this time, I think, sort of my tenure was coming to an end at Housemarque, or it had just sort of come to an end. And I was sort of just thinking, actually, with all of the connections that we've got with the businesses and the challenges that we're now starting to face, innovation is something that, is almost, we start to sort of professionalize and improve and share around it. So, that was where Din was born.
And stars aligned by the sound of it.
Yeah. And as with a lot of things during my career, serendipity's played a big part. And that great adage, the harder you practice, the luckier you get. The more you network, the more the opportunities will come. Is absolutely true. So Din was sort of born as an idea then.
What was that first meeting like? When you stood in front of those members. Were you more nervous then when you came in the television studio today?
I was a lot more nervous then, because you got to remember, this was a startup business.
Sure. So extra pressure completely.
And when you're relying on that to sort of pay the bills, pay the mortgage, and things like that, it has to demand sort of your full focus and attention.
So a bit of a personal question then now. So did you have any doubts because of that, what you perceived as failure when you went off on your own with the consultancy? Now, clearly very different business model right now, but was any of that doubts in your mind?
You always have doubts because you're going into the unknown. And until you get some reference points, you're not in a position to say, I know this is going to work. But I've always sort of been, I won't say confident, but I've always sort of been assured that actually, I pay a lot of stuff forward. So, I share a huge amount, a lot of the network members hopefully relate to that. But if I find something interesting, you'll get a WhatsApp, a text, you'll get an email around this. So therefore, you've got a very big community to go to. And I think when I'm having conversations with people, you know, they're always willing to sort of share back. So if I was not going down the right route, you know, my friends would have told me and would have said, nah, there's absolutely no demand for this. They didn't, and said, actually, yeah, this is really, really sort of good timing around that. So the first meeting that you asked about, I think we had about 20 people there, and you know, I wouldn't exactly call it a disruptive agenda that we actually had on. It was quite of its time around that. But what it did do, it generated a germ and a seed of idea that we could then have conversations, and immediately had 20 organisations that, oh, I tell you what, we like this. If you're going to do some more and pull us together, we'll be part of that.
And word gets round, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, you know, that's something that's been the whole tenet of DIN in terms of, you know, I probably refer to it a bit like the A-team in terms of we don't, if you can find us, we'll help you, because we don't advertise massively around it. This is about word of mouth, and I think, you know, this is part of the challenge of the kind of network we wanted to grow. Was it had to be a community, and it had to be people who subscribed to a certain set of values about why they were part of the network. Because when you are working with a board and you've got shareholders and things like that, it puts a very different dynamic on it in terms of what drives that. In terms of DIN, I was always determined that actually it was about purpose, and it was about outcome, and about improving the social housing sector, and ultimately the lives of the tenants and residents who rely on those 4 million homes.
What was your first big delivery within DIN? What was the first thing you can look back on and go, yeah, that's the first main project or initiative that I delivered that actually benefited my members? What would you put your finger on?
There's a number of things. I mean, as I say, I think we do purposeful inspiration really, really well, i.e. we can motivate.
What a phrase. Purposeful inspiration.
Purposeful innovation. Purposeful innovation.
Okay.
We don't just
do inspiration. That's quite a nice phrase as well.
Well, it is, but I think somebody's already got that one. That was probably something else I've nicked. But the point around it was that actually don't just do things for doing the sake. Actually, you've got to actually have an outcome at the end of it. And part of where I think DIN got to was we could inspire and motivate people, you know, quite well. But I also wanted it to be more than just really great speakers that you came away and you listened to for a day, and then you go back and actually nothing changes around that. So we were determined that, you know, the business had a portfolio of different things. We'll come on to sort of the 3D learning bit and how that sort of came about. But in terms of the first big piece, we actually did a report. I was really keen that we did some research, and you may recall this one. We did it around the future for housing IT services.
Yeah. Is that the one I contributed to?
I think you might have contributed to to that one. Yes.
A couple of little quotes.
And we did. Yes. So we did that with a number of sort of colleagues around. And the reason for doing that was actually it wasn't big and it wasn't sort of sexy around it. But when you think about the impact that technology can actually have across a housing business, yet in most housing organisations, IT is still a support service.
Yeah.
And part of what came out from that research and the report was actually if housing organisations want to take that next leap, they need to move the IT services from a support service to a strategic advisory role, because too often decisions and policies are made up here, which are then passed down to the IT team to implement, when actually that advice would have been really, really useful at the point of that sort of policy formation.
Cultural transformation, isn't it, that you were getting at? You know, that's a big part of it. And then I remember the report that a lot of detailing what would your operating model look like in the future, you know, if you went in this direction. I didn't realize that was the first, what you felt was your first delivery of research. So that's very interesting. So we think you're getting to 3 years old this year. Is that right?
We're probably just out of startup stage and moving into sort of scale up stage. It's been a heck of a journey. It's moved on incredibly quickly. I think it's exceeded all expectations about where we actually are now.
And you're over 100 members? Is that
right? We're over 100 members.
Count?
Exact count. We've had 2 join this week, so I would say 109.
And I did, out of respect to those members, I did promise I'd ask this question. Could you name all those 109 members now?
I probably could have a good go at naming all, because that's where I've not managed to let go yet, Chris, of personalization on it. But these are some of the challenges that we're going to have as a business, moving from some startups to scale up, because we've got to have that infrastructure in place to be able to manage all of these people. But I mean, I didn't start off like this, you know. I mean, I think in the early days, I tell you what, we'll get to 30 members and then we'll stop, and that'll be a nice number, and we can get around all of them.
I remember actually saying that to me once, actually.
Yeah, and then we'll get to 50, and we'll stop at 60, and then, you know, suddenly from that it just grows. But as I say, with that growth is coming a whole new set of challenges, because once you get past that initial sort of stage, we need to make the whole issue of innovation really sticky and not just be, this is a nice to have. So, we can talk about what the future plans are later on.
Absolutely. We're doing well for time, actually. So I think one of the interesting things for me, what was unique about the network when I started working with you in the early days, is your strategy for selecting the delivery partners. You had a very clear strategy on that. I wondered if you could give us a bit of information on your strategy.
Yeah, I mean, having worked in social housing for so long, and particularly, doing big things with IT companies and things like that, I think I was absolutely clear that there was already a really good outlet for IT companies working with the sector that had good reputations, and a lot of people know them. So there was no point in duplicating what was already there. So the strategy for delivery partners were two things, really. First of all, is this a disruptive technology or a disruptive business model that's coming in? And is it innovative enough for the social housing space? And at the point in time back in 2018, whilst the cloud had been around for a long time, it wasn't something that people really sort of talked about. But having spent time going into some of the cloud providers, it was quite obvious to me that actually this is something that is going to enable housing organizations to genuinely have that step change in the way that they deliver services. So I was fascinated by that whole sort of concept around that. So the delivery partners had to be companies such as AWS, some of your competitors, the Microsoft. Doing very well. Sorry about that. Yeah, but also the likes of Rackspace and a whole host of what we would call sort of new suppliers or tech startups who were coming in that were really trying to solve problems in the social housing space through the use of technologies. And for me, that was fascinating, because that played to my, I'm learning something new here. And I think that's been absolutely the key tenet of what we do. So we're moving massively now into the space of prop tech. So the whole real estate management side of that, and what does that actually mean for social housing landlords as to how they manage their assets, deliver the customer experience, undertake repairs, all of those sort of things. And there are so many organizations, because I think, as I said at the outset, the social housing sector, whilst being a massive sector, I think something around about 28 billion pound a year,
that's right.
It's quite a hidden sector. And it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that organizations like AWS have said, actually, we could do something here. We're going to invest something in this particular space. So that's how we choose our partners.
Absolutely. I think one of the first events that we delivered together was, as you termed it, I won't steal the idea, Hack the House, which did sound like some sort of house party, didn't it? Or some sort of rave, which was in essence a competitive hackathon where we had 4 housing associations attend. And I think it was quite eye-opening for me at the time, because we often talk about how the sector needs to think as builders rather than buyers. And I just wonder what you felt about that experience, because I think that was probably the first hackathon you'd run.
It was the first hackathon that we ran, and I didn't know what to expect. And then because of the way that we set up, I don't think my members knew what to expect as well.
I don't think we knew what to expect either. I'm just letting you know.
No, but again, Chris, I mean, this is one of the points around actually just try something. What's the worst that can happen? And I think that was our first time that we came down to sort of Amazon headquarters, which again was an attractor in itself. That people came down because you then got immersed in that feel and that culture of, wow, what does this mean? What does that mean over there? I mean, my big recollections about the 24-hour hackathon was, first of all, it was hard work. The people who participated in it did have to work very quickly. Secondly, the abundance of post-it notes and writing on walls that was sort of done there. But thirdly, the speed with which we took a housing organization's problem and then built this sort of skeleton, this minimum viable offer to actually say, well, this is what it looks like. And I think that was a real revelation to those who participated in it. That actually, you can really, if you start to understand the problem, you can really get to the end very quickly.
I mean, the final presentations were actually very impressive, weren't they, when you consider how much time they had? I think it's always interesting when you put people under pressure. Some people react to that really, really well. And I mean, it was a great experience. I mean, my view on it is that some of those projects weren't taken forward for whatever reason. But in terms of instilling a bit of a cultural approach to solving problems, I think it served it well. And we've since done lots of other things together where we've explored innovation model at Amazon, for example, which is quite easy for organizations to absorb and adopt and so on. But we've not done another hackathon yet, though, have we?
No, and perhaps the time is coming. I think with the lifting of COVID, I think another Hack the House 2 might be the follow-up.
2.0.
Yeah.
So just before we move on, because I want to talk a little bit about how DIN transformed in the pandemic, because we can't really do an interview without talking about the impacts of coronavirus and so on. But I just wanted to focus a little bit on that term disruption, because it's quite a bold term, isn't it, really? And how did you come up with it, and why was it such an important part of your message? Because disruptive, it's a big word, isn't it?
It is, and in some cases, it potentially could be a millstone in terms of from a business point of view, in terms of, you know, if it falls out of fashion, for example, we don't want to be disrupted. You know, we've done disruption kind of thing. It could be sort of challenging around that space. But again, from a social housing perspective, I think what sort of preempted it was, I think I'd been in housing so long that there was a new program or a new set of programs coming through that actually, this was the third time I'd heard, oh, this is a new way to transform. And I thought, hang on, you know, I've probably been here enough. If we're going around something for the third time, is it time to sort of disrupt it? But the main thing was, you see so many things in your own personal life where sectors and organizations are being disrupted. And whether you're looking at, you know, Uber, whether you're looking at Amazon, you know, Apple, whatever, you know, aspect of it, you think, hang on, that is going to be touching on our lives. And why would social housing be immune from that sort of disruption? Yeah. So that was what the driver was, helping organizations get prepared for, you know,
the reality of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I just kicking myself I didn't have a global pandemic on our work plan, but there you go.
It's amazing. Moving on to the pandemic, it's amazing, you know, this very unwelcome, compelling event and what that's done to organizations across multiple domains to transform how they do things. I mean, he was even having a chat with the team here around what they did here in the television studios to adapt. But for you, I guess your own business and so on, you're still in that kind of scale up stage. What was your approach when it all kicked off? I mean, we of course had a trip to Seattle planned.
We had
lots of things we had to cancel, but
it was interesting. And again, I put this down to sort of, you know, my ignorance of not knowing what was sort of going to come, because if you think about it, actually it's probably the best thing that happened to the network. So we had two companies. We had DIN and we had the consultancy bit, which did the delivery of side of that. Overnight, the consultancy stuff, we just had to stop and park. And it's only now is it starting to sort of emerge from that. So for the first 2 weeks, you know, the thinking was, oh, wow, you know, the whole world's going to collapse. And actually, we haven't got a plan B here. You know, there's nothing else you can do. People are suddenly going to, you know, batten down the hatches and look at budgets and start to wind them in. And actually, we're a subscription as a service model. So people pay a monthly fee to be part of that. And actually, if that cuts off, you know, where else is it going to come from? So after about 2 weeks of, the sky's falling in, actually, we just sat down. And I mean, there's only two of us in terms of myself and my wife, Michelle, and about sort of 3 associates that work with us. You know, we just said, hang on, you know, we're fretting about things that we can no longer deal with. So our mantra from that was, well, actually, stop worrying about things you can no longer do. Focus on the things that you still can do. And once we got through that mindset and we got through that uncertainty piece, actually things started to fall into place. So we couldn't do the 3D experiential study visits. You mentioned, I mean, we had 2 massive programs for, you know, the spring of 2019, as I say. We're taking 25 leaders across to...
I'm glad you clarified that, because when I said before, it sounded like you and I were just going to Seattle.
Yes, yeah.
I didn't actually mention that we were going to take some members, so members could learn. But yes, it was very much a different thing.
So from a business point of view, that was a huge hit to us, because there's probably about 50K's worth of income and investment that had gone into that. You had to refund, because we also had a study visit to Lego, and so we're going to Denmark. So all of this was already done, and it just overnight it just stopped. But once we started to sit down and think, oh, actually, what our organizer going to want? And for whatever reason, organizations started to think, actually, we're going to need to innovate now. We've never been here before.
Because is it right? You didn't really get many cancelled subscriptions, did you?
No, we still don't. We still don't. I mean,
there wasn't a side effect of people saying, and that's it.
No, and I'm hugely grateful for the members' sort of patience around that. So we're clearly, I think, doing something that is of value to the sector. But what happened was the network then just started to take off. And most of it was word of mouth. Most of it was through members talking to members. And as a result of that, as I say, we just had some exponential growth. I mean, we were getting 2 or 3 new members joining every week for a while as well, which was quite scary because, again, we hadn't been geared up for that.
You can argue, couldn't you, that at that time when people are at home and they're adapting to their own circumstances, you can argue they need that collaboration more, couldn't you, in many senses?
Yeah, I mean, the way I sort of refer to it is, COVID was a once in a lifetime sort of impact whereby there was no consultants, there was no frameworks, there was no guidebooks, there's no reference points for anybody who's been through this. So everybody was just about at that same point. So having an organization who at its heart has collaboration, actually bringing people together to say, look, we've got this problem. I've got a clue how we're going to solve this, but tell you what, together, we might be able to progress this, has been absolutely sort of pivotal in what our model
I think
is.
One of the things I kind of reference as well when I think about how you operated in that environment, and obviously we were all doing our own things to operate differently too, but you really raised the level of content. You weren't quiet. You push that up to level. So things like the Dimcasts, which I think have been very, very popular, and also more research papers and so on. So there was still a lot coming out of Dim. So I think if I was a member in that situation, I'd still feel very much like I was getting value from it.
I hope so. I hope in terms of what the return on investment is for being part of the network is there. I mean, again, we kept close to our values and ethos in terms of we won't duplicate what others are doing within the sector. That's not what we're there for. It's about sort of bringing things from outside of the sector. So yes, we had to sort of change, and we had to do more collaboration and more projects. So you're right. I mean, the Dimcast was interesting. If you want to have a look, we've got our own YouTube channel. Go and have a look at Disruptive Innovators Network. I think we've got over 60 Dimcasts on there, and that just started from what we're going to do. Tell you what, why don't we phone some people up, see whether they're interested in doing a podcast. And we just did 15, 20-minute podcasts, and we just went to a whole range of different people to do that.
And most importantly, you bought yourself a posh podcast microphone, didn't you?
If
you invested in it.
It's proud to say I'm the owner of a Blue Yeti. It's the size of a small child and could easily be used as a murder weapon as well.
So we're gonna come to a few questions in a minute because there's a few questions on the chat. But let's just close off the Dimcast because they have been very interesting. Back to 3D learning, you somehow, I don't know how you do it, but you get to talk to all sorts of interesting people. Are you just relentlessly charming with them and then they can't say no? But
I'll relate it again. It was another lesson I picked up. You may be familiar with the gentleman Casanova who on his deathbed was asked, well, how did you get to sleep with so many women? And his response was, I just asked. And it's the same with me.
Absolutely.
Throughout, if you ask people, most people are more than happy to give you their time and share their thoughts.
Might need to clarify that with Michelle later on. Anyway.
Yes, I will.
But just let's close on the Dimcast. So who was the most interesting? Because there was which one appeals to you when you came off and went, wow, that was
we did all sorts. We did Tony Blair's press officer, Alistair Campbell. We did the CEO of AO.com, and so we did some big global brands. Probably some of the most interesting ones, and this is always will be where I go, is the social entrepreneurs, people who've actually found a business as doing some social good that are really making an impact around this. So some of the guys from the homelessness innovation, the homelessness organization, Beam, who came from the world of fintech. I loved what they're doing in terms of tackling homelessness through microfunding homeless people. A great guy who gave me this badge called Matt Potts, who founded the Camarados. Again, he was an ex-homelessness advisor. Ironically, his Dimcast, if you want a really interesting one to go and have a look at, he's a proper character. And I just love people who are driven by that social purpose. Yeah.
Absolutely, we're in the right sector for that. Yep. Let's come to a couple of questions. We're doing pretty well, I think. We're not going to. Let's come to a couple of questions. We've got some nice comments as well. Disruption forces change. There you go. So we've got 3C Colin. I think we might know who that is. What does Ian think the social housing provider of 2025 will look like compared to today? Well, thanks, Colin. I won't ask that one later, but I'll let Ian answer it now.
Really good question. It depends, because there's actually going to be two answers to this, because
it's only 4 years away.
It is only 4 years away, but part of the challenge the social housing sector has got is that the business model it's got is unique. I've not come across it before, and it is incredibly stable. If you were in a business, if Amazon were in a business whereby they got 80 to 85% of their income guaranteed by the government, margins north of 30%, little or no competition, and a steady state of sort of IT supplies around that, innovation is not necessarily, or disruption is not necessarily something you want, because it would disrupt that particular business model. If we were looking at this through a lens whereby the social housing sector had been disrupted and what housing organisations would look like, I'd love to think that we could take some of the learning that we've had from other sectors and actually deploy that within the social housing space, because there are still things that when I was a housing officer, we're still doing those things today. And that was, 25 years ago. And I'm thinking, surely we must have moved on from that. So I think, as I say, a lot will depend what route and how brave housing organisations are and how far they want to go down that sort of that change route.
Sure. So next one, Ian mentioned other sectors. What can other sectors learn from Ian's experience? And this is going to allow you to talk about some of the other initiatives you're involved in, because you're not just housing, are you?
No, and again, that's part of what we're sort of trying to do, because again, what the last 3 years have taught us is that the issues that social housing is facing, it could be any business. I mean, our 3 pillars of the business are based around technology, leadership, and culture. It doesn't go in that order. Just TLC was a really good acronym that I like using. We tend to start with the whole piece around culture. And I've been very fortunate in my time, we talked about the whole experiential learning piece, to have been into nearly every organisation that I've wanted to be in, to go into and learn from what those organisations. So whether it's social purpose organisations, such as the Eden Project and what they're doing around sustainability, into the likes of IKEA, and looking at what they do around, putting the customer at the heart of things, to the work that we've done with Amazon, looking at, working backwards from the customer kind of thing.
That's
as well.
A perfect segue to my next card that says innovation culture. We're not professionals here.
Yeah.
I think for me, innovation, the fact that innovation is so rooted in your principles and the philosophy of the network, that aligns perfectly with Amazon as a business. And I think generally Amazon's seen as a very innovative business. But I'm going to ask you a big question now, because every organization in some sense has a desire to be more innovative, right? But if a housing provider comes to DIN and they say, we want to be more innovative, how do you answer that? Where do they start? What's the first step on that journey?
Well, the first thing to sort of understand is, DIN is not necessarily an open network. I won't say the
so you'll tell us to go away.
No, we won't. I mean, our bar's probably on a level with Madeline in terms of if you can sign your signature and you've got a quid, you can probably get in. Yeah. But we do, over the last sort of 3 years, I have evolved some questions for organisations but my first starting point is, what's innovation look like to you? And kind of describe that. Most leaders can describe what innovation is. It tends to be the big innovations rather than what you and I probably know as innovations are quite small scale and iterative around that. The next question will be, do you practice ethnography? And when they've
ethnography, sorry, should I know what that means?
Well, once we've Googled it, it's walking in your customer's shoes. And what I will tend to ask is
ethnography.
How many times in the last 3 months have you, not your business improvement team, how many times have you actually gone and walked a customer problem end to end? Because if you've not done that, you're going to have real difficulty answering the next question, which is, do you understand the problem that you're trying to solve? But the big challenge, and that I've not really got over, and it's probably the one that provokes most debate with exec teams around this, is you come to join the network, therefore innovation is important to you, therefore it's something you'll invest in, and it's a value to you. So this is what these big tech companies invest in R&D into innovation as a percentage of turnover. And I think Amazon's nearly sort of 20% in terms of what you spend in that. So my question back to that organization, so how much do you invest as a percentage of turnover into R&D, into innovation? And that's probably the deciding question as to whether we are right for each other as an organization around that.
Would you agree, though? We are seeing more directors of innovation and innovation culture in the sector on the whole, aren't we? they're having a go. Definitely, there's a lot of organisations really, and I know you're helping a number of them as well.
There is a big appetite because I think what leaders are recognising now is, and again, I've had this conversation a few times recently, is social housing providers are service providers. They provide a service, a really important service. They provide a roof over heads. They provide support services and all of those things. But ultimately, from a customer, resident, tenant, consumer perspective, they will judge you on what that service is actually like. And I know a lot of CEOs and execs that I speak with have this thing to say, well, actually, tell you what, they're probably getting services from a lot of organizations, and this will become amplified during COVID. So, they're getting good experiences from these delivery companies and these service organizations. So we want to be like them. So I think that's what the drive is. And ultimately, that's what's going to have the most lasting impact if innovation is owned by the leaders and the CEOs within the organization, because they'll make sure that actually happens.
So what about failure? If someone says to you, well, how can we, we're a non-profit business, we've got a value for money agenda, we've got to demonstrate where we're spending things. How can we possibly invest in projects that may fail and that be compliant with how we approach business? Yeah,
I mean, it's the story I always tell is the one from a really good guy called Paul Taylor, who's the innovation coach down in Bromford, who about 8 years ago decided to set up what for me was the first housing innovation team. And they took a report to the board and to the executive to say, we want a six-figure sum, set up this team, and we're going to fail 3 out of 4 times. So you imagine that, and particularly in those sort of challenging times, that period saying, actually, basically, you're going to lose a lot of money. You're going to lose essentially 75% of this, but they took the brave decision and they went ahead with it. After the first year, the KPI, I think, was, you would say, was a success because they only failed 2 out of 3 times around that. So that was a sort of a measure of success. But, and again, failure is something that actually is a natural consequence of you experimenting. I think Jeff Bezos sort of used the phrase, if you're undertaking an experiment, you know what it's going to come out like at the end. It's not really an experiment.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we're trying to get members to be more comfortable with, that there will be failure around this, but through working with DIN and working with our partners and the frameworks that we've actually got, the failure won't have a material impact on the business, but you will learn a huge amount about this. So we're just wanting people to be more comfortable with it in terms of when things don't go wrong. It's what you learn from that.
Yeah. Have you read your Working Backwards book yet that I sent you?
Have I worked my Working Backwards book?
Have you read your Working Backwards book?
No, I haven't read that as yet, Chris.
So there's a lot of failure in there. There's a lot of failure.
There is, yeah.
And it's amazing how Amazon does embrace failure in many ways, like encourages failure, because they know that every now and again there will be a big success, a big ticket success.
Well, I think
some good stories in there.
Well, I mean, a couple of I can recount because we've talked about them before, which was around, some of the big failures that Amazon have, and housing will never have at this scale. But who remembers the Fire Phone?
Yeah.
Who's got one of those sort of Fire Phones? Or when they try to take on eBay with the Amazon auction, and things like that. And I think that really sets, I suppose, the culture and tone for what Amazon's about, which is actually, we're not frightened around failure here. We'll have a go at that.
Yeah. So let's move on to the future of social housing, because it is an interesting time, isn't it? I mean, I feel like we've had more white papers than we've had in a long, long time.
Yes, yeah.
They seem to be coming, I can't read them. They're just too big. I'm sure you've read them.
Yeah.
But if, as we come out of the pandemic now, we think we're going to be potentially done, hopefully, might be an extension, but once the country's vaccinated, what's the future like for housing providers now from an operational point of view? What does that post-pandemic workplace look like? I know you've done a lot of research into this.
There's a number of different areas. I mean, change only happens within social housing in 2 ways. The leadership bit, which I've talked about, or through regulatory or statutory provision. So what the government tells you have to do. And you're right, there's a number of white papers, building safety bill, the social housing white paper that is sort of going through, which is certainly in England is going to shape the future. But it's still going to take some time for that to come through from a legislative perspective. So we've probably got a couple of years in which to get prepared for that. So this is my message to members is, right, actually, this is coming through. So what you're going to do to get prepared for it. So there are things, the immediate things, the business as usual stuff. So the future of the office. We're going to have to be, what my friend Anthony Slumbers talks about, prepared for the hub, home and roam. So people working in different spaces and things like that. So a great example the other week where
Hub, Home and Roam.
Hub, Home and Roam. Hub, Home and Roam, yes.
Remember that one.
And I love the example where Places for People, Dave Cowan's team, are now using some of their spare office accommodation to welcome in local entrepreneurs to come and work there. And I love the whole philosophy around a social WeWork. You know, for some social housing tenants who can work from home but can't because their accommodation is right. Well, actually, hang on, you've got social housing organisations, good infrastructure, good IT support, fast Wi-Fi. Well, you know, that's really good. And I think another really good example is what Bronwyn Rapley has been doing across at Onward Homes, where they've converted some of their spare office accommodation, area office accommodation, into social supermarkets. You know,
I've seen that on Twitter.
So some really good examples around that. So I think that's going to be. But I think that the two key things that will be starting to keep leaders awake at night are the tenants and residents' voice and the work around that, what that's going to look like, and of course the whole health and safety and well-being around the properties and the buildings. And again, this is where technology can start to play a significant role in helping you meet those objectives.
It's definitely I don't like to take us here necessarily, but there's definitely a data maturity journey, isn't there, for the sector? What's your view on that? I don't want to get too technical, but if we talk about things like resident voice and more scrutiny on resident voice and GDPR, all those things, data quality governance, data strategy is more important than ever, surely.
It is. I mean, we did a couple of sort of roundtable challenge sessions there the other week about data. We've got another one on tomorrow with some solutions to it. And part of the discussion was actually we're getting too much data. You're actually getting too much data to be able to take informed and better decisions around this, and far better to focus on the attestation and the transparency and the quality and the provenance of where this data has actually come from. Because I still don't think we're at the stage that we really sort of value the quality of the data that's going into some of the decisions that we're actually making. So I think that's going to be absolutely key. But also, again, and this is what I say to members about technology, is there are a lot of things in business that are hidden. But actually, the technologies that are coming down the line, and bear in mind our role is about that future-facing bit, that actually makes those invisible issues visible. So what are you going to do to use that technology to find out the answers to things that are currently invisible?
Yeah, that's a very interesting aspect to me, that the future of the organisations really is delivering services from the home and outwards, you know, in that sometimes called proactive sense. And I think what you're alluding to there is that data you don't collect now that's actually potentially very interesting, because that's what the new technology is going to help them do. Let's move on to the future of DIN. Now, I think we've maybe got 5 or 6 minutes left. Yeah, I don't know if I can just end it when I want. I'm not sure, but I'll just carry on. I'm getting a few nods and a few thumbs, so that's all good. But clearly been a great success so far. So what's next for the network? Where do you see your impact now? What's the post-pandemic DIN look like?
Yeah, I mean, we are still sort of, you know, throwing this around in terms of what do we want to do, because again, part of what I set out to do with the network is it's got to be a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah,
it can't be sort of dragged down through some of the, you know, the corporate stuff that used to affect us. How do we maintain that athleticism as a startup whilst we sort of continue to grow? I haven't got the answers to that yet, but I think some of the key things around this are that there are lots of interesting projects that we've not touched on yet. I mentioned before we do the purposeful inspiration innovation piece, but actually that's probably not enough. How do you then embed it, and how do you really start to change cultures? So one of the things that we want to sort of move into is, I suppose, the learning, development and the education piece, both from a leadership perspective, but also skilling future leaders to understand what innovation actually is. So we're working with a guy called Chris Bezic, who's, you know, the author of the innovation culture, about an Innovators Academy. And that will be launching in the autumn, whereby hopefully we'll be able to take future leaders on that journey to really understand so many different elements to what innovation actually is. So moving into the education space, DIN Labs is something we've not sort of touched on yet. DIN Labs was one of those things that came to the fore when we couldn't do the study visits. So that's our test and learn platform. So it's our rapid sort of prototyping. So basically 10 to 12 weeks, testing out a technology, testing out a business model, Will this transfer? Will this work within social housing? So we're going to do more of those. We're doing some really interesting ones, disruptive ones at the moment that I think will be interesting to see how they land within the sector. Things around stop measuring customer satisfaction because it's the wrong measure against customer expectations, and undertaking stock condition surveys in minutes rather than weeks and things like that.
The people focus is interesting to me because often we can get so embedded in technology and buzzwords, and I'm actually delighted to say we've not really done any buzzwords today, have we, at all? We won't do any before we end the show, but people are what make technology work. So that's an interesting strategy for me that you're having a big focus on that. And you've even done some work in what recruitment of people into the sector looks like, haven't you? You've even spent some time there, because I'm always amazed. You said earlier, it's a strong sector. It's really financially strong. It's remained strong throughout the pandemic. It should be attractive to people. It
should be hugely attractive. And I once got a snippet from, I suppose, what I would call, he's our strategic advisor, a guy called Simon Devonshire, who's the entrepreneur in residence at Rolls-Royce. And I asked him, how did he manage to, through his career, attract the best people? He says, you attract the best people by giving them the best problems. Yeah. And social housing as a sector is a brilliant sector to be working in because you can genuinely change people's lives as a result of what you do. Yeah. So it should be a good thing. I mean, in terms of sort of the recruitment, I think there's two things. You're right. We've just produced a report with Campbell Tickell on the future. The future for people services. And this looks at a whole range of issues around well-being, why that's going to be important. How the work now gets done. So as leaders in a post-COVID world where you've got a distributed organization, if I was to ask you, well, how do you know how that work's getting done? Would you be able to tell me? The whole issue around diversity and inclusion, the skills that we're going to need, and what it's going to be like working in a post-COVID housing organization. And again, this is not being written. So a lot of this is going to be sort of experimental in terms of what works for your organization, particularly your organizational culture.
But people are the disruptors, right? That's the whole point. Disruption doesn't happen without people disrupting.
Yeah, exactly. And it's often put forward that people don't like change. People do like change if they know what that change is actually for.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely key. You've got to take people on a journey. Disaster management is very top down. So last year, at the point of COVID, you had to take decisions. You didn't have time to consult. It was just right, do this, do that. Disaster recovery is going to be from the bottom up. And I think this is something for leaders to start the conversations with their teams around, well, look, we're going to need to have some people in workplace analytics coming in here because everybody's working in different ways. What is the best way of installing that for our organizational culture? What's going to be effective? What's not going to be intrusive? What's going to keep you on side with that?
Brilliant. Well, I've had the sign. We need to wrap it up, Ian. I mean, knowing the two of us, we could sit here and we could talk the arse end of a donkey, if I'm allowed to say that. But thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to go much deeper on the network, how it was created, and we work very closely together. But I didn't know literally 95% of all that stuff, so I certainly feel much more well informed. I'm sorry we haven't got any more time for any more questions. I hope you enjoyed this section this week in the MPO office hours. We will be at next week as planned. Jason will be your host for that. But for now, it's goodbye from me. It sounds like University Challenge.
And it's goodbye from him.
Bye-bye. Have a lovely day.